My name is Ibrahim Traore. I am the president of Burkina Faso, a land that carries within it dignity and wounds, courage and long memory. I speak not only as a head of state, but as a man shaped by the Sahel, where the sun is harsh, the soil is stubborn, and hope must be protected every morning as if it were water. But Burkina Faso does not stand alone. Across Africa, and especially across the Sahel, our nations are bearing a shared burden. Terrorism carves scars into our villages. Poverty drains the strength of our mothers. External powers speak loudly about order, yet wherever they pass, disorder often remains. Our people are weary of speeches that promise salvation but deliver only more graves. We are a continent that has learned how to survive, yet is still struggling to learn how to heal. It was within this context that night arrived. I was tired in a way that sleep alone cannot cure. It was a rare weekend, and just as rare, I turned off the news. I had read too much about war. Too many arguments dressed revenge in the language of justice. Everywhere I looked, people were increasingly certain that they were right, yet increasingly uncertain that they still knew how to love one another. Power was praised as if it were proof of moral virtue. Violence was justified as if it were courage. As night settled in, I prayed. Not a long prayer, not a brave prayer, just one single question, whispered almost in fear. Must we hurt others in order to change the world? I did not wait for an answer. I did not expect one. The question itself was heavy enough. I lay down and let that weight rest upon my chest, a weight that seemed to sink deeper as the room fell silent. Then sleep came, without warning. But in that sleep, I was not given comfort, I was given a confrontation, not with enemies but with meaning, not with slogans, but with conscience. What I saw would not flatter me. What I heard would not excuse me. It simply, quietly asked a deeper question. Who do I intend to become? And it was at that very moment that the dream began. The place where I found myself had no walls, yet it felt enclosed. No sky, yet I knew I was not underground. It was neither light nor dark, but something in between, as if reality had paused to listen to itself. I could hear my own breathing clearly, each breath sounding louder than it should have, like a reminder that I was still responsible for being alive. That was when I saw Jesus. He did not arrive with thunder or radiance. There was no spectacle, no choir, no sense of performance. He was simply there. His presence did not overwhelm me, but it held me still. His eyes carried a calm that was not comforting in the way people expect comfort. It was the calm of someone who sees everything and refuses to lie about it. He did not greet me as a ruler. He did not name my title. He did not accuse or praise. He looked at me as a man who carries choices that cannot be undone once made. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it did not invite debate. It invited honesty. You have asked whether change must pass through pain, he said. But you have not yet asked who will carry that pain. There was no anger in his words, no threat, only a warning shaped like a question. I wanted to explain myself. I wanted to speak of enemies, of pressure, of history, of necessity. But before I could form the words, he shifted slightly to the side, as one does not to interrupt but to reveal. That was when I saw him. Nelson Mandela stood behind Jesus, not as a symbol, not as an icon carved in history books, but as a man who had lived too long with suffering to romanticize it. He wore no suit, no sign of office. His posture was slow, steady, and unafraid. In that moment, I understood something before it was said. Jesus had not come to glorify Mandela. He had come to show me that Mandela's path only made sense under the light of human dignity and love. The dream was no longer about history. It was about choice. Mandela did not speak at first. He stood beside Jesus, not behind him, not in front of him, equal in humanity, unequal in role. That detail stayed with me. Leadership, I realized, is not about height. It is about weight. Jesus turned to Mandela, not as a judge, not as a king. His question was simple, almost unsettling in its simplicity. He did not ask, Mandela later told me, who I defeated. Jesus asked him only this, what did you save? In the dream, Mandela did not recount apartheid. He did not describe the cell, the years, the humiliation. He did not rehearse suffering as proof of virtue. He spoke softly, as one speaks when the truth no longer needs defense. My greatest victory, he said, was not walking out of prison. It was leaving the prison behind when I did. Those words struck me harder than any accusation could have. I had seen many men freed from chains who still dragged the chains behind them. I had seen nations liberated that remained imprisoned by memory and rage. Mandela was telling me that freedom is not an event. It is a discipline. He looked at me then, not with authority but with responsibility. Do not build power on hatred, he said. Do not define yourself by the enemy. There was no romance in his voice, no pride, only caution. I felt something uncomfortable rise in me, a thought that sounded reasonable, even noble. But what if the enemy refuses peace? What if restraint is mistaken for weakness? What if forgiveness invites more harm? Mandela seemed to hear the question before I asked it. The leader who defeats an opponent, he said, wins a moment. The leader who stops the cycle of hatred wins a future. That was the lesson Jesus wanted me to see before anything else. True leadership is not the art of crushing resistance. It is the courage to prevent tomorrow from becoming yesterday again. In that moment, I understood something frightening. Tyrants are rarely born from cruelty alone. They are born from justifications that sound moral, from decisions made once, then repeated until they feel necessary, from leaders who tell themselves they have no choice. Jesus did not interrupt. He did not correct Mandela. He simply watched me. And I realized he was watching to see whether I would listen or whether I would already be preparing my defense. The temptation revealed itself clearly then. The temptation to believe that my anger was righteous, that my certainty excused my severity, that my enemies deserved whatever followed. It all sounded reasonable, it all sounded strong, and it all carried the quiet seed of something dangerous. Mandela had known that temptation. He had lived with every reason to surrender to it, and yet he had chosen something harder. Hatred, he said to me, is a lazy form of power. It demands nothing from the future, only payment from the past. That sentence stayed with me. I thought of Africa, of Burkina Faso, of young men who had known only violence and were being told it was destiny. I thought of how easily leadership can become a mirror of the wounds it inherits. Jesus finally spoke again, not to Mandela but to me. You will be praised for defeating enemies, he said, but you will be judged for what you allow to grow in their place. I did not answer. I could not. Because the question was no longer theoretical. It was already waiting for me in the world I would wake up to. Jesus looked at Mandela again, not with approval, not with concern, only with a question that cut deeper than praise ever could. Were you afraid of being misunderstood? He asked. Mandela did not answer immediately. He lowered his eyes, as if weighing memories that still carried weight. I was afraid, he said, that my people would have to bury more of their children. That was when I understood something I had misunderstood for most of my life. Forgiveness is not softness. It is not sentiment. It is not the absence of anger. Forgiveness, when chosen by a leader, is a moral strategy. Mandela was not forgiving because he felt peace. He was forgiving because he saw the cost of continuing the war inside his own people. He knew that civil conflict does not purify a nation, it fractures it. It produces poverty, disease, and grief that outlive any political victory. I had always been told that forgiveness belongs to the private soul, that politics belongs to realism. Mandela destroyed that lie without raising his voice. There are moments, he said to me, when refusing revenge is the only way to protect the innocent. That sentence unsettled me, because it meant that violence is not always chosen out of hatred. Sometimes it is chosen out of fear, disguised as responsibility. Sometimes leaders convince themselves that they must strike first to prevent chaos. I felt the argument forming inside me. It was persuasive. If we do not act decisively, we will be seen as weak. If we forgive, we invite disrespect. If we hesitate, others will take advantage. Mandela placed his hand on my shoulder. It was not heavy. It was steady. There are times, he said, when forgiveness does not make us weaker. It removes the reason for violence to exist. That idea terrified me more than force ever could, because force offers clarity, forgiveness demands imagination, force gives an enemy a role, forgiveness removes the script. Jesus watched this exchange quietly. He did not glorify forgiveness. He did not promise it would be understood. He only allowed the truth to stand where excuses usually hide. You fear being misunderstood, Jesus said to me, but misunderstanding has never been the greatest danger to a leader. I knew what he meant. The greatest danger is becoming someone who believes their cause absolves their methods. Someone who stops asking whether they are still protecting life or merely managing death. Mandela had chosen forgiveness not to erase justice, but to prevent the country from collapsing into endless retaliation. He knew that nations do not die only from invasion, they die from internal exhaustion. I thought of Africa again, of how many conflicts begin with promises of security and end with generations of mourning. Of how easy it is to justify brutality when fear becomes policy. The temptation in this section of the dream was clear. It whispered that anger keeps order, that punishment creates stability, that mercy is a luxury reserved for peaceful nations. Mandela had rejected that logic, not because it was false, but because it was incomplete. Justice without restraint, he said, is simply revenge wearing clean clothes. Jesus did not contradict him. Instead, he looked at me with the same calm seriousness and asked a question he did not answer for me. What will your people inherit from your fear? I had no answer then, and I am still forming one now. The space around us changed without warning. There was no movement, yet everything was different. Before us appeared three objects, suspended as if memory itself were holding them up. A key, a ballot, a constitution. They did not shine, they did not demand attention, they waited. Jesus looked at them, then at me. You are given keys, he said, but not all keys are used to open doors. He did not raise his voice. He did not explain. He did not need to. I understood what he was asking before Mandela spoke. Power, Mandela said, always presents itself as a correction of the past. The question is whether you are healing the wound or simply changing who bleeds. That sentence unsettled something deep in me, because I had already seen how easily liberation can become reversal, how prisons can change hands without changing meaning, how revolutions sometimes replace one set of victims with another and call it justice. Jesus pointed to the key. Did you use it to open the door? He asked Mandela, or to decide who would stand behind it next? Mandela answered without hesitation. I chose not to execute, not to confiscate, not to purge. The words fell heavily, because I knew how rare such choices are, especially when the wounds are fresh, especially when the crowd demands balance through pain. I felt another temptation rise in me, one that sounded responsible. If those who harmed us are not punished, will injustice not return? If we show restraint, will others not think crimes are forgiven? Mandela had faced that same argument. He did not dismiss it, he acknowledged it. Power, he said, always tempts us to believe that suffering must be returned in equal measure, or history will repeat itself. He paused, then added quietly, history repeats itself most violently when pain is redistributed instead of ended. That sentence stayed with me. I thought of leaders who promised to avenge their people and ended by ruling through fear. I thought of constitutions rewritten in the name of stability, elections postponed in the name of security, laws bent in the name of survival. All of it sounded reasonable. All of it could be defended. All of it carried the risk of becoming permanent. Jesus did not praise Mandela for restraint. He did not call it holy. He called it purposeful. Power, he said, is not given to balance suffering. It is given to stop it. That was when I realized the deeper danger. The most destructive leaders do not begin by seeking cruelty. They begin by convincing themselves that cruelty is necessary, that it is temporary, that it will end once order is restored. Mandela had resisted that logic, not because he was immune to anger, but because he understood what anger does when it is allowed to write policy. He turned to me. If you use power to return pain, he said, you will always need more power. I felt that truth settle heavily, because power gained through fear must be maintained through fear, and fear does not sleep. The objects before us faded, but their meaning did not. Jesus looked at me again, not as a warning, but as a responsibility. You will be tempted, he said, to believe that changing who holds the key is enough. He was right. Changing hands is easier than changing purpose. Changing rulers is easier than changing systems. Changing enemies is easier than changing habits. Mandela had understood that power is not proven by how firmly it is held, but by how carefully it is used. In that moment, I understood something painful. Leadership is not measured by how much control one gains, but by how much harm one refuses to inflict, even when given permission. That lesson did not bring peace. It brought clarity, and clarity, I was learning, carries a cost. Mandela motioned for me to follow him. We did not walk far, yet the space shifted again. We entered a room without walls, without guards, without a judge's bench. There were no gavels, no uniforms, no symbols of authority. Only chairs, only voices, only tears. This, Mandela said, is where we chose truth over triumph. I understood where we were before he named it. It was the spirit of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Not a court of punishment, but a chamber of exposure. A place where crimes were spoken aloud, not erased. Where victims were not silenced. Where history was not rewritten to flatter the present. Jesus stood at the entrance, not presiding, not intervening. He did not sanctify the process. He allowed it to be human. Justice, he said quietly, does not require revenge. It requires truth. I felt another resistance rise in me. It sounded reasonable. If there is no punishment, Will truth not become cheap? If there is forgiveness, will crimes not be minimized? Mandela did not deny the risk. Truth, he said, is more dangerous than punishment. It does not end when the sentence is served. In this room there were no shortcuts. Those who had committed violence were required to speak, to name what they had done, to face those they had harmed. Forgiveness was not automatic. It was conditional. It required honesty. It required exposure. No one was allowed to hide, Mandela said. And no one was allowed to pretend the wound did not exist. That struck me deeply. I had seen nations attempt reconciliation by silence, by forgetting, by moving forward without looking back. Those nations did not heal. They only postponed their reckoning. The temptation here was subtle and dangerous. It whispered that peace requires forgetting, that stability requires amnesia, that unity is easier when the past is buried. Mandela had rejected that temptation. A nation, he said, cannot be healed by lies, even comforting ones. I thought of Africa again, of borders drawn without consent, of wounds passed from one generation to the next without language to explain them, of leaders who promised unity by banning memory. Jesus spoke again, not loudly, not solemnly. You cannot heal what you refuse to name, he said. That truth unsettled me more than any condemnation could have. Because naming wounds demands humility. It requires leaders to admit failure, to accept that their people were hurt not only by enemies, but sometimes by their own institutions. Mandela had chosen truth knowing it would reopen pain, knowing it would anger some and disappoint others, knowing it would not deliver the satisfaction of revenge. Justice that hides, he said, becomes a lie. Justice that exposes may wound, but it also cleans. I felt the weight of that lesson settle on me. It was not a strategy for popularity. It was not a guarantee of peace. It was a commitment to dignity. The danger of power revealed itself clearly here. Leaders are tempted to control the story, to curate memory, to decide which truths are safe enough to be told. Mandela had refused that control. He had trusted that a people treated with honesty could bear the truth, even when it hurt. Jesus looked at me then. You will be tempted, he said, to choose order over truth. I knew he was right. Order is quiet, truth is disruptive, order feels responsible, truth feels risky. But without truth, order is only silence waiting to break. Mandela's path did not erase injustice. It confronted it without reproducing it. That distinction mattered more than I had ever understood. And it was not finished teaching me yet. I turned to Mandela with a question that had followed me long before this dream. If you had stayed, I said, your people would have elected you again. He smiled. Not with pride, with recognition. That, he said, is why I had to leave. His answer disturbed me more than anything else he had said, because it cut against one of the most seductive lies in leadership, the lie that continuity is virtue, the lie that experience justifies permanence. The lie that a nation is safer when one man remains at its center. Mandela had not rewritten the Constitution. He had not extended his term. He had not surrounded himself with arguments about exceptional times. He had walked away while admiration was still warm. Jesus looked at him, not with approval, but with understanding. Power, Jesus said, becomes dangerous when the one who holds it believes he is irreplaceable. I felt that sentence press against my chest. Because every leader hears voices telling him he must stay. That he alone understands the moment, that stepping aside would invite chaos, that humility would look like abandonment. Those arguments sound reasonable. They are often spoken by loyal allies. They are framed as concern for stability. Mandela had heard them all. I did not leave because I was tired, he said. I left because my staying would teach the wrong lesson. He understood that leadership is not only about what you do while in power, but what you normalize for those who come after you. A single exception becomes a precedent. A temporary adjustment becomes a habit. Adjustment. A temporary adjustment. I thought of Africa again. Of constitutions bent until they break. Of leaders who begin as liberators and end as prisoners of their own image. Of nations taught to wait for one man instead of building trust in institutions. The temptation here was perhaps the most dangerous of all. It whispered that responsibility demands control. That surrender is betrayal. That stepping aside means wasting influence. Mandela had chosen differently. A leader who refuses to leave, he said, eventually teaches his people that they cannot live without him. Jesus did not interrupt. He let the truth stand on its own weight. I realized then that tyranny is rarely announced. It grows quietly, fed by fear and praise. It is not born from evil alone, but from compromise. From small decisions justified by urgency. From leaders who tell themselves they will step down later. Later often never comes. Mandela had known that. And he had acted before the lie could settle in his bones. I felt exposed in that moment. Because the future is full of invitations. Invitations to stay. Invitations to bend rules for good reasons. Invitations to believe one's own necessity. Jesus looked at me steadily. You will be tempted, he said, to confuse being needed with being called. That distinction stayed with me. Being needed flatters the ego. Being called demands obedience to something higher than applause. Mandela had left not because he was finished, but because the nation needed to learn how to stand without leaning on one man. That lesson was not gentle, but it was merciful. The space grew quiet again, not empty but attentive, as if everything that needed to be said had already been spoken, and now only one truth remained. Jesus did not praise Mandela as a hero. He did not call him great. He said only this: you treated even those who imprisoned you as human beings. There was no drama in his voice, no elevation, as if this were not an extraordinary act, but the minimum expectation of moral leadership. Mandela nodded slowly. He did not accept the words as an honor. He accepted them as a responsibility already carried. I understood, Mandela said, that dignity does not belong to the innocent alone. That sentence cut through every political instinct I had ever been taught. We are trained to divide the world into victims and villains, to protect dignity for some by stripping it from others, to believe that once someone has crossed the line, their humanity becomes optional. Mandela had rejected that belief. Human dignity, he said, is not a reward for good behavior. It is the foundation of peace. I felt resistance rise again. It sounded noble, even beautiful, but it also sounded dangerous. If we treat everyone as human, do we not excuse cruelty? Do we not weaken justice? Mandela answered the question without defensiveness. To deny dignity, he said, is to teach others how to deny it as well. That truth settled heavily. Because brutality does not remain isolated. It teaches, it spreads, it normalizes itself. I thought of prisons, of interrogation rooms, of language used to describe enemies as animals, vermin, threats rather than people. I thought of how quickly societies accept cruelty once it is framed as protection. Jesus looked at me again, and this time his words were not directed at policy or history. Leadership, he said, does not stand on the side of winning or losing. It stands on the side of human worth. That sentence dismantled the idea of victory itself. It meant that success cannot be measured only in territory gained, enemies defeated, or systems controlled. It must be measured in how many people are allowed to remain human under pressure. Mandela understood that dignity does not depend on race, party, or history. It does not belong more to the oppressed than to the oppressor. Once dignity becomes conditional, it ceases to protect anyone. The temptation here was subtle and seductive. It whispered that some lives matter more, that some suffering is acceptable, that cruelty is justified when the cause is righteous. Those arguments sound practical, they sound strong, they sound inevitable. Mandela had rejected them. If you remove dignity from your enemy, he said, you will need to remove it from yourself to continue. That was the cost. Jesus did not add to this, he did not need to. The lesson was complete, and it left me with one final question I could not escape. The dream did not end with a command, it ended with a question. Jesus turned to me, not as a teacher concluding a lesson, and not as a judge delivering a verdict. He looked at me as one man looks at another when the answer cannot be borrowed. Do you want to be remembered as a winner, he asked, or as someone who left peace behind? The question was not poetic. It was surgical. I waited for Mandela to answer. I waited for guidance. I waited for reassurance. None came. Mandela did not speak on my behalf. He did not offer advice. He did not soften the moment. He simply turned away and began to walk. His steps were slow, not hesitant, certain. I realized then that no leader can outsource that choice. Not to history, not to ideology, not to religion. Every generation must decide whether power will be used to dominate or to protect, to harden or to heal. I wanted to say that peace is fragile, that enemies are real, that threats do not disappear because we choose restraint. All of that is true. But it is also true that brutality creates its own threats. That fear multiplies enemies faster than force can destroy them. That violence, once normalized, always asks for more. Jesus did not correct me. He did not argue. He allowed me to see the consequences without disguise. Victory, he said, ends when resistance ends. Peace continues after memory fades. That sentence carried a quiet finality. I understood then that tyrants are rarely born from evil intent. They are born from compromise, from leaders who tell themselves that one exception will not matter, that one harsh decision will not define them, that once stability is secured, morality can return. But morality postponed is morality surrendered. The dream was no longer symbolic. It was painfully practical. I saw the temptations clearly now. The temptation to silence dissent for the sake of unity. The temptation to delay accountability for the sake of order. The temptation to accept cruelty because it produces immediate results. Each temptation came with logic, with urgency, with applause, and each one carried the same destination. Jesus did not ask me to be perfect. He did not ask me to succeed. He asked me to remain awake. You will choose, he said, not once, but every day. That was the hardest truth of all. Because there is no final victory that releases a leader from vigilance. There is no moment when power becomes harmless. There is only daily discipline or slow surrender. Mandela was already disappearing into the silence. Not as a symbol, but as a reminder. The dream began to fade, but the question did not. I awoke with no sense of triumph, no feeling of reassurance, only clarity. The world I returned to was unchanged. Burkina Faso still faced threats. Africa still carried wounds. The Sahel still demanded strength. Nothing in the dream removed responsibility, but it changed how I understood it. I speak now, not as a man who believes he has chosen correctly, but as a man who knows the cost of choosing wrongly. Leadership is not proven by certainty. It is proven by restraint, by the willingness to question oneself before questioning others. To my Muslim brothers and sisters, to Christians, to believers and skeptics alike, I say this: faith does not exist to justify power. It exists to limit it. To the leaders of the Sahel and Africa, I say this: our people do not need stronger rulers. They need safer futures. No nation is saved by fear alone. I say for futurization is saved by fear alone. To the world watching from afar, especially those who care about Jesus and about leaders, I offer no sermon, only a confession. Power tempts every man, and the greatest danger is not corruption but self-justification. I ask for blessing, not for dominance, for wisdom, not for control, for the courage to step back when stepping forward would cause harm. May Africa learn to heal without forgetting. May justice speak without shouting. May leadership remember that it exists to serve life, not command it. Every morning I wake up and must choose again. There is no final victory, only awareness or surrender. If these words stirred something in you, stay with the conversation, reflect, speak, listen. And if you wish to continue walking through questions like these, you are welcome to remain here, where reflection is not rushed and conscience is not silenced. Each day, I choose again, and so do you.